folks. Welcome to another episode of The Hole on the Corner, where we talk all things R.A. Lafferty. I'm Dan Peterson. I go by the handle of Dr. Rockter here on the YouTubes. And this is a video that I have been contemplating making for probably about the past 6 months or something like that. And have tried to make a couple of times, have made a lot of notes for, and have not come up with a satisfactory way to approach this material. For me, I am still trying to process it, and I have not been able to, I guess, sort of craft a frame by which to get hold of this. To get right to the point, this has to do with a letter that Lafferty wrote in 1990, in which he very clearly expresses a denial of the Holocaust. He outs himself as a Holocaust denier, which is troubling to say the least. More like disturbing and repugnant. And I have several times thought of just turning on the camera and just trying to talk about it, and haven't quite been able to bring myself to do that either, but that is what I'm doing now, finally. I think perhaps I am going to sketch out how I have thought about trying to approach this rather than like, here it is. So for starters, we should just, look at what Lafferty said. You'll see the letter on the screen as I read it, portions of it. Lafferty is writing to Dan Knight, someone who published him in sort of an indie press way back around that time. And he is responding to one of Dan Knight's short stories that he had sent to him called The Bigot, and must have had something to do with getting in trouble, publicly being censured for one's objectionable views. And so he begins to riff in what seems to me a pretty paranoid way that is often typical of some conservatives, which then leads him into the topic of the Holocaust and so on. So he says, by the way, Canada wasn't the first with the anti-hate laws. They have them in France and in West Germany, and I believe in other places. Publishing the opinion that the Holocaust didn't happen can land one in prison, and there are persons in prison for this offense right now. I myself never did accept the idea of the Holocaust in the context of the 6 million. As a prophecy, it's been in the Talmudic literature for a couple of thousand years, but it has always been a sort of allegory until the time of World War II. But if indeed 6 million Jews were killed, between a third and a half of the Jews in the world, and more Jews than were in the maximum area ever controlled by the Germans, then they should have left a big hole in the total Jewish world population. But they didn't. By the end of the war, within 5 years of the end, North America had received more than 1 million Jews from Europe. So had South America, so had Israel, and the total world Jewish population was up considerably from where it had stood at the beginning of the world. And when Germany was losing the war for shortage of manpower in the factories, there was no sense in them killing 6 million of the most intelligent workers in Europe. There were work camps, yes, and likely a lot of cruelty in spots in them, but there weren't extermination camps. But I believe that the only book debunking the Holocaust that I had read before running onto the Journal of Historical Research was The Myth of the 6 Million, Anonymous, published by Noontide Press in Los Angeles in 1969. Then, probably in about 1982, I found one of the issues of the Journal for Historical Review at a used book sale. What's this, I asked myself, since my hobby has always been history. Why haven't I heard of this before? The journal was about 2 years old, and it didn't seem to have caused a ripple. The journal did show convincingly, to me at least, that the Holocaust couldn't have happened, and the only answer that could be given to it was, the proof that the Holocaust could have happened is that it did happen. And the passing of laws that the Holocaust must be accepted as a historical fact, and the savage penalties to be assessed against those who claimed that it wasn't historical fact. And several of the most famous historians in the world being stripped of their degrees by law and forbidden to teach or write, and persons in prison for offenses against the Holocaust laws being murdered there. And he goes on for another whole paragraph mentioning that, Holocaust deniers have come to universities, and a lot of the students were quite convinced, and that there was a big debate set up between various scholars for and against, and that the ones who were going to argue for the Holocaust having occurred sort of chickened out and didn't show up, and Lafferty's all snarky about it. And then he concludes after that, sorry, I didn't mean to take so much space for the Holocaust that never happened affair. All right, so there you have the raw material. I think it sucks. I think it's gross, icky, lame, stupid. I mean, honestly, I do, and that's part of what baffles me, because I don't think Lafferty is a stupid person. And, what makes it so much worse is not just that he, denies that the Holocaust happened, that mass extermination happened, but that he goes on at great length about it, thinking he's making some kind of historical case for it. It so happens that one semester, I can't even remember now if I actually taught this for a couple semesters. Regardless, at least one semester I was helping teaching on a course at the University of Glasgow in comparative literature, where one of the texts was Mouse by Art Spiegelman. And if you read through a book like that and you see this man having these conversations with his father about what the father remembers of being in extermination camps and so on, and the great effort that has been taken to render this, in this case in a comic book format using anthropomorphized animals, and it's, as you would imagine, it's extremely harrowing stuff. That's just one example of the many things that people have written from that time who were there. I've read Viktor Frankl's book In Search of Meaning, which is a quite helpful book, and in which he details, things of living in the camps and so on. I'd read a bit about and from Dietrich Bonhoeffer in these camps. Obviously, not all of these sources particularly get into the mass exterminations going on and so forth, but some of them do. And of course, it's just, it's one of these things that's just gobsmackingly well documented. And the level of conspiracy from so many disparate parties that would need to be going on for these museums to exist and so on is truly kind of an insane level of paranoia to think that's how we have this array of evidence and so on. Not to mention, just so much of it, quite apart from that, is just sort of incontrovertible. And this isn't anything I really know about. I mean, I don't study this era or that particular issue or anything, but just, sort of casually having come across it through various readings and so on, it's one of these things that, it is obnoxious and rather mad. And, I say that with respect to those who have mental health issues and the whole problematic history of crazy and so on. But it is unhealthy mentally, I think, to deny such a thing. That's all I can really say about it. That's not a very sophisticated comment, but that's just like, where I kind of sit with something like that. And, that's like a very extreme example of conspiracy theory, but I personally have never connected with conspiracy theory. Lots of people I know who I respect even, can entertain some conspiracy theories and stuff. And a lot of people talk like that's kind of like, we all have some conspiracy theories and so on. Maybe so, I'm not sure, but I've never been drawn to them. They just don't interest me. They don't they don't tickle my brain as they seem to do for so many people. And that's a reason why I have never, really engaged with or been interested in that layer in Lafferty's fiction, because it's a huge layer that kind of punctuates everything, this whole idea of conspiracy theories and so on. And it's a big part of one of his probably greatest novels, Fourth Mansions. And it was a reason why I couldn't get into that novel at first. And now I really love it. But I kind of had to work past the whole, and it's just like a fictional conspiracy theory sort of, or a metaphysical one almost. But And it's more interesting the more you get into it, but it's just not something that's immediately going to draw me in. So to see Lafferty's thinking around that mode or genre, you could almost call it conspiracy theory, uh, be put to such a ridiculous and kind of reprehensible notion or claim, is deflating. um, yeah, it's a bummer, and it colors the rest of his fiction in a way that makes me, extremely suspicious. And I know in a lot of literary theory, we're kind of meant to start from a place of suspicion and so on. Like conspiracy theory, that also has never like really massively tickled my brain. I think it's more complicated. Reading literature is more complicated than starting from such a position, but it certainly has its place. But Lafferty has earned my suspicion in this regard. So that's, sort of my immediate like emotional and intellectual reaction to that. And that's just like sort of one thing. There's so much more to it, and almost in some ways the more important part to me is, how to conceive of Lafferty and his work in light of something like that. And I find it very difficult. Now, there's various ways we could approach this and various things to talk about. I will say here that the person that drew this to my attention is someone I have mentioned on this channel before, John Nelson. I will link to his essay on this letter and related issues, which has links to more of his essays on these related issues, particularly anti-Semitism in the work of Lafferty, which we'll come back to in just a second. But when John pointed me to this letter, I felt that I was seeing it for the first time. And that's still how I perceive it. I do not remember seeing this letter in the archive. It is possible I saw it in the midst of quite a few things going on. I either didn't clock its importance, which would be as embarrassing as anything else. I mean, how could I not clock the importance of that? Or that it had to do with some other things I had seen that I was indeed disturbed about, but at that time didn't know how to deal with, and thought maybe the others were going to deal with it and got slotted in there. And that's still a little, regrettable that if that was the case. But as it stands, I don't remember seeing it. And certainly seeing it now, it struck me as of great importance and some urgency to address. Now, it just so happens that in the very last video I made on chapter 8 of Lafferty's novel Past Master, that I had begun to address some of what I consider objectionable in Lafferty. And in that case, it had to do with queerness, LGBTQ+, and his attitudes toward that. And to those who saw it, I suspect it seemed a bit of a stretch that I was addressing that issue based on what was said in that portion of that chapter. But it brought it up for me, and it's something that can be circled back to and dealt with a little more. And I will say that I think his potentially anti-queer sentiments only come through here and there in his work, and I'm not sure they really fit much into the structure of his work, although his kind of anti-stance on it does fit into his Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics of essence and so on. But I don't know that he really tries to get into that in regard to homosexuality, or in some ways in terms of gender, because I think he does a lot of interesting sort of bending things with gender, which we'll get into at some point. There is some of that going on in Past Master with some characters, but more so in other books. I've been noticing it a lot in certain things going on in Arrive at Easter Wine, a novel of his from 1971. So I had made that video, actually, even though I only put it up a month or so ago. I had made it a long time ago, like around June or something, I think, and just hadn't been able to find time to edit it and put it up. But it was like right after that I heard about this letter. So like, it's the timing is actually, kind of works out a bit because I've already begun to address this, and there's other issues. That was a build up toward dealing with other stuff that I want to look at with Lafferty that I find problematic. And one of the biggest issues for me is related to anti-Semitism, but it's just more Lafferty's way of dealing with race in general, which I will say in the past I think I thought was interesting and kind of, laudable or on the right track or what have you, but latterly had seen more and more, was just kind of wondering, like, wait a minute, is there, is this kind of essentialized, about races of people and stuff? And so I had wanted to try to begin to address that when this came up. And so, and it all ties together. And you'll see, if you go to John's site, you'll see him show a couple other letters from Lafferty and some pretty crazy stuff that he says. And one had to do with, black writers in science fiction being recognized more for being black than for their writing or whatever, kind of like sad puppy type stuff, if that controversy. I mean, I don't hardly know anything about that with the Hugo Awards and stuff a while back. But, people, conservatives, again, as far as I can tell, are the only people who make these complaints. But yeah, about that, this comes up or has come up in all kinds of areas. And so Lafferty just displayed a very typical attitude in that regard, which is, again, super disappointing, bummer, lame, stupid, to me. So, unfortunately, you scratch the surface here, and there's more to see, more ugly details. But what I had noticed in his fiction in general, and then in certain things in the archive, was that there was a current concern, and a few of us were talking about it at the time, that there was some potentially latent anti-Semitism in Lafferty's work, and perhaps blatant. It was a little hard to tell. And then there was at least one reader in the small group of readers interacting at that time who seemed to themselves to be a principled anti-Semite, who was bringing out that element in Lafferty, of course, feeling that they had found a kindred spirit in regard to such things. So there are even those who are favorable towards something like anti-Semitism who have said they see that in Lafferty's work. Though even that person admitted there were perhaps a few places in Lafferty that almost seemed to go against that, to counteract an anti-Semitism of any kind, but especially in his own work. And that anti-Semitic reader of Lafferty felt that was a flaw in Lafferty. And it was things like that sort of counter evidence or counter move in there that kept me guessing and making me think, I don't know what to make of it. I'm not sure what's happening there. Is Lafferty being anti-Semitic or not? And is there a contradiction going on here and an inconsistency, et cetera, et cetera? And unfortunately, it would take a lot of work for me, because I haven't read in great detail or over and over again most of Lafferty's works that deal more explicitly with Jewish characters or questions about the place of the Jews in the world, and the fact that Lafferty even has those kinds of thoughts in his fiction is to me kind of a red flag. But it's also, of course, inherent to Christian theology and the New Testament, and oftentimes focused on the Jews and their relation to the Christians. And because Jesus came from the Jews, was a Jewish person, and how do we and came from the, was fulfilling Jewish prophecies from Jewish scripture and so on. So that's always kind of there, baked into Christianity, and is potentially a source of a sort of baked in anti-Semitism to Christianity. I don't know if I think there are versions that go against that, but whether that thread is kind of in there from the beginning, I guess, is something I have not studied or don't know about. So I can't even address the theological issues there and the historical theological issues. So you can see, as I'm rambling on here, just how ill-equipped I am to kind of speak to this issue, and it would take a lot more research all in that direction for me to address it. But I'll say that at the time, what a few of us were talking about it was this question of whether Lafferty had sort of hardened into some kind of, and more blatant, just barely vocal anti-Semitism in his later life, along with perhaps other hardening sort of conservative attitudes. And that was sort of an open question, and trying to figure out if that's what had happened or if it was baked in from the beginning. Now, John Nelson's perspective on this is that the anti-Semitism comes in early in Lafferty's works, and if you look at some of his essays on that, he's pretty convincing on that point. And furthermore, that Lafferty should be taken at face value in the letter when he says he's never bought into that there was a Jewish Holocaust. It's something that didn't happen, or that he has never believed has happened. He's never bought into there being 6 million who died, which it's really hard to just even say that stuff. It's just, one feels so gross saying it, even when the one is quoting someone else. But since Lafferty says he never bought into it, John says, yeah, like he was a Holocaust denier all along. That's a tight piece of logic. Does seem to go from the evidence we can see, so yeah, he's pretty convincing on that point as well. I find him more or less totally convincing as regards anti-Semitism being evidenced early in Lafferty and here and there right the way through, and then that Lafferty seems to self-profess that he was always a Holocaust denier. That doesn't look like a big, oh, well, let's look closer at that. It seems pretty clear to me. That said, I do still think, it's like, not exactly an open question, but a sort of, ongoing developing situation in terms of all the facts and interpreting those facts and putting a framework on it to understand Lafferty as a person as a whole and his body of work as a whole. And the thing that had disturbed and alarmed me at the time when I went to the archives was this thing that Lafferty keeps referencing in that letter, the Journal for Historical Review. So I saw he had a catalog from that place, and it's full of, books denying the Holocaust and similar sorts of things. And I was just like, what the fuck is this doing in here? And I remember asking around about it at the time from other people that had seen the archive, and they had seen it too. And it was kind of an open question as to, was this something, I didn't see any evidence as to like whether Lafferty had ordered it. That seems the most likely simple answer, and is probably the case, but or whether somebody had sent it to him, these sorts of things I just don't know, because there didn't seem to be anything else around it or any interaction with it or anything. It was just there, and but it it didn't look good. But I think there was this question about trying to put all the pieces together of Lafferty's biography and his timeline and what's going on in the fiction itself, and so on, to try to understand all this stuff. And I was pretty late in my PhD at that point, certainly halfway through, I think well over halfway through. And, I panicked for a minute, and I thought, uh-oh, do I need to like change my topic, or, just like do a different author than Lafferty or something? Like, I'm not really prepared to deal with this. It's a whole different kind of study than what I'm doing with my eco-criticism and monster theory and everything. And I'm not really doing a biographical look at this author. I did touch on that in my first chapter, but it's not a big part of what I was doing, etc., etc. And I decided that I would continue on, finish with what I was writing about, wait and see how others began to position this kind of thing with Lafferty, and then kind of work that into my further writing about Lafferty. So as you can see, that just kind of like somehow got on everybody's back burner. I don't know if everybody was, to the degree that how many people even knew about this or understood it or thought there was an issue here, and so on. But like that, if and where there were people who did know of these things, and it just seemed to get on the back burner. And I'm not sure if other people like me thought, I don't know how to deal with this, I'm waiting for you to do it, you do it, I don't know, again, to refer to John Nelson, he is, I think, pretty understandably and justifiably annoyed and upset that this has not been dealt with in the scholarly community. And you can see where he will point to a scholar who did a PhD on Holocaust material in science fiction and who referenced one of Lafferty's novels, The Three Armageddons of Enniscorthy Sweeney, which is about the era of World War I and World War II. And I'm afraid, I've only read it once, and I'm afraid I did not really clock the fact that the Holocaust is, as I understand it, just not dealt with at all in that novel in terms of, Jews and extermination camps and so on. It's dealing with other things about the wars, and that that is conspicuously missing. As I've said before, it's one of my favorite novels by Lafferty. I think it's a very ambitious work, well written, and just absolutely fascinating. But also that it is the novel. It's funny that I've said this before. The novel by Lafferty and the novel ever that most melted my brain. Like, I literally was like, it psychically hurt me to read that novel, and it had to do with the fact that he was seeming to affirm contradictory things about whether the wars happened or not, and so on. And it's all part of like a fictional, thing happening in there, a trope or a approach or whatever. And it has to do with, these operas that this guy is writing that seem to either erase the world wars or bring them back because they've been erased. Is very confusing to me. But in the midst of all that melting of my mind, I seemed to have missed something very important, which I'm bummed, how could I not see something like that, and wonder about it. But the person who wrote their PhD on that interpreted the absence of the Holocaust in a certain way in Lafferty's novel, and saying certain things that, if that scholar had known that Lafferty was in print as a Holocaust denier, he probably would have changed some of how he was interpreting that novel and what it meant and what Lafferty was trying to do with that absence there. And so John Nelson feels that, now we've got this new academic work dealing in part with Lafferty. I mean, it's only a portion of the PhD thesis that deals with that novel. That is kind of misinformed, that didn't need to be, and it's kind of marred that academic work, according to John. Now, I don't know if that's a whole separate issue that I don't know if I do agree with or not. I again find John persuasive in this regard, and I'm not sure what that scholar thinks. I know he's been in touch with that scholar, and so on and so on. So this is the thing too. I hope John will understand when I say this. I'm just going to say this. We've had a lot of chats behind the scenes, and some in the comments here and comments elsewhere and so on. And, we're pretty frictious. It's no secret between the two of us or anyone else who sees us talking. I think we read Lafferty extremely differently in certain respects. I think we overlap in respects as well. I think we are coming from very, very different ideological positions. I'm like a post sort of Christian person, post-evangelical, post-Christian, not a Christian anymore sort of person who's still super interested in theology and in the theological reading of Lafferty and so on. And John is self-professedly, a conservative Catholic like Lafferty, and coming more from that position. Obviously in John's case, very much minus any kind of anti-Semitism or anything like that. But that ideological difference between us and literary critical difference between what we think is the way to read literature in general, and Lafferty in particular, makes it adds a tricky layer here of how I'm going to engage with John talking about these things. And I've told John, that I find him, sometimes needlessly, unhelpfully, I guess, antagonistic about some of these issues, and not least about, the apparent scholarly failure to deal with this material in Lafferty. However, I also sympathize with where John's coming from, and it's hard to fault him on that point, even if I don't agree always with his interpretations or his flavor that he brings to it. And even there, a lot of the salt and spice from John, I don't really mind. I be that way myself sometimes, or engage with others doing that. It can be quite fruitful. So I feel like I'm not sure where land with how John's handling it, but I will say I do appreciate the work that John has done on this, kind of tracing some things out and stuff. The funny thing is, as he traces things out and his whole theoretical approach to it, he starts to lose me again. And I'm like, oh man, either you have like referenced so many things I know nothing about, so that I can't really comment on, or you have kind of made this huge schema about Lafferty and about this work and so on that I can barely follow. It would take a lot more, sort of reading and rereading and research to engage what John is doing there. And to the degree that I can understand it, sometimes I'm like, no, I don't think that's a good framework or theoretical approach to this at all, or at least in certain key respects, yada yada, which is how he feels about a lot of my readings as well. And we've told each other that. And, that's standard, interpreting an author type stuff. But it makes dealing with this kind of material about the Holocaust denial and so on just all that more difficult. So, the links will be there to his work in the description here, with the proviso that, that's not a blanket endorsement from me about his, website and his approaches, but there is a level of respect there, saying like, well, you're trying to address this in a meaningful way and get it on the agenda for Lafferty readers and scholars. And that's a good thing. On that note, too, I will also mention that sometimes I get referred to as a Lafferty scholar, and sometimes I've very much allowed that to happen. I don't think I've ever said that of myself. I have definitely mentioned, like, I did my PhD on Lafferty, etc. Even that's a little misleading. So let me rethread that needle just a little bit here and say that I don't think I do consider myself a Lafferty scholar. When I hear of someone being a fill-in-the-blank author scholar, like a Gene Wolfe scholar or Ursula Le Guin scholar or what have you, I think of them as someone whose main focus of research is that person and their body of work, and that is going to involve a lot of biographical information and so on. And that is not my approach to Lafferty. As a fan, as a reader, I'm very interested in that kind of thing, but as an academic, I have not really pursued that. Again, as I've said, there's a bit of that in my PhD, gestures toward that. It could be something I move into in the future. But my PhD was really about my theory of the eco-monstrous, probably primarily. And then as applied to readings of the works of R.A. Lafferty, and in much less scope, Cormac McCarthy. But the preponderance of that reading being on Lafferty meant that I got more into interpreting Lafferty's body of work as a whole, and I guess nudging into what could be called Lafferty scholarship, or the work that a Lafferty scholar would do. So it's like, I guess I would say I've done some Lafferty scholar type stuff, but I don't think I'm a Lafferty scholar. I just don't. I wish I could say that I am, but that's not really what I'm doing. And I think some others are. I won't say who at this time, just because, I'll just like leave it at that. I don't want to put that pressure on people. Let them define themselves as they want. But I think as this tiny community of people who would even think about such a thing have been quick to, if there's an academic writing about Lafferty, he gets called a Lafferty scholar. And it is he. Almost always a he. And I'm not saying that to try to get myself out of dealing with this Holocaust denial material. I think I've put that out there. That cat's out of the bag. I got to deal with it. But it affects the ways in which I can, and the what I bring to this. And for the time being, my approach of trying to read Lafferty through an eco-monstrous lens, and perhaps other lenses, but particularly just being about reading Lafferty's works, seeing what they're doing with the genre of science fiction, seeing what they're doing beyond that genre. All that you may have seen, if you've been following this channel, the things you've been seeing me do chapter by chapter with his novel Past Master. So when it comes to this issue of Holocaust denial and related issues of anti-Semitism and so on, that's my approach. how does this fit in with these works? How does this fit in with the poetics that Lafferty practices? How does this fit in with how he elides materials and does a lot of things about amnesia and absences, and of course conspiracy theories, and how he evokes things through the grotesque and the monstrous and so on, as well as his sense of humor that is often a very dark sense of humor. You know, how do these issues around Holocaust denial and so on relate to all of that? How do those things express that or go against it? And this is where my biggest challenge is at right now. I have tended to see these, what I consider flaws in Lafferty as a person and in his writing, as confusing and as contradicting, I guess, what I see as the positives in his writing. And I've wondered, how can the same person do these things? And how does this body of work have things that are pulling off in these different directions in that way, morally and ideologically and so on? But I've been challenged recently from several interlocutors, not just John, but some other people I've been talking to as well, to try to see how something like Lafferty's Holocaust denial actually flows from what he's doing in his fiction and the poetics that he has, or the two flow into each other and cohere. And so I'm trying to begin to look at those things as well. And part of what I'll be researching actually is trying to see how other problematic writers are received in today's readership and scholarship. You know, the most obvious and famous example is H.P. Lovecraft. And I have actually mentioned H.P. Lovecraft in this regard in relation to Lafferty before, where Lovecraft's racism is actually very on the surface and very obvious, and in that way makes it a little easier to deal with. Whereas I think Lafferty's problematic areas like anti-Semitism and so on are tend to be more covert, and that makes it harder. And even to the degree that they're unintentionally or unconsciously covert, that makes it harder. But what I had thought of doing for this video was trying to, you know, just like place the two poles of Lafferty side by side there with something like this Holocaust denial letter. And then what? You know, I was going to like bring up a few of my favorite passages or something that just speak to the beauty that can be found in his work. And, you know, I was struggling to find the right passage or passages to do that and so on. And I had just finished a rereading of Arrive at Easter Wine, so that was really on my mind. I think there's some incredible things in there, especially toward the end, about seeing the shape of the universe and what that might be, and what people are, what persons are, and how they're tied to communication and communion and these sorts of things, and how persons are so much bigger than what we can see. Basically, what seemed to me some kind of anti-essentialist ideas about people and the world, even though I think that same novel may be instantiating some of Lafferty's essentialism as well about races or women or what have you. And so even just thinking of bringing those things up was making me more confused and like, wait, can I even cite these? Because like, is it just going to bring me into new problematic territory? What do I do here? But to try to just wrap up this complete ramble, without necessarily citing passages, let me just say that I had actually been, in my own personal journey recently, thinking of Lafferty's place in my intellectual and personal journey, you know, because it's not just the mind, it's the heart and so on. And I realized that Lafferty is kind of a key figure for me. It took a long, long time, but for me kind of moving beyond my own cultural background attachments to forms of problematic, you know, conservative sort of attitudes. And I'm using conservative in certain ways. I'm not trying to brush off everybody who is a conservative in one way or the other. It's a bit of a shorthand placeholder, but, you know, sort of reactionary perspectives on today's society, especially progressive elements in today's society and so on, that were theologically motivated in the community I came from. And strangely enough, Lafferty, the kind of arch conservative in some ways, maybe in all ways, I'm not sure, but was one of the sources that really started to open my mind and my heart, because I think his fiction is a mind-opening sort of fiction. The metaphysics that comes across in his stories, even if they're just fictional metaphysics, okay, about space and time, personhood, and so on, is such that people tend to read his fiction, those who do, the few who do, and walk away with their brains fizzing toward openness, toward exploration, toward wonder, toward, opening of questions, and the sense of the world being bigger than what we thought, and that it's hard to reduce things or people down to anything, because things overflow, people overflow. There's more than can be caught in any one conception of people and things and so on, the world. And Lafferty's fiction just does that, and within that, Lafferty's fiction is possibly the main source, at least early on, say in my early 20s, that like really got things like non-humans on the radar for me, and just like really, really got me thinking about the environment, nature, non-humans, and so on. Even though, Lafferty may have a certain take on all that. Indigenous peoples and views came through somewhat strongly in Lafferty's fiction for me, and made me think about them as present contemporary people in ways I just hadn't been aware of, and got me looking into their works, their novels and so on, and just, opened me to that and got me curious and interested in that. And again, potentially Lafferty is very problematic with his portrayal and evocation of these peoples. Interestingly, I would say this: I think that his evocations of Native Americans are a little less problematic. I'm concerned about them, but I think they're just a little less problematic than his evocations of indigenous peoples in, say, Indonesia, where he served in World War II. I think they come across, there's still an attempt to be respectful and curious there from Lafferty, but I think they come across to me as a little more essentialized and almost part of the environment. Whereas in North America, because he actually knew Native American people in his life and growing up and so on in Oklahoma, I think he just had to engage with them in a less essentialized way, or he didn't have to, but he chose to based on, knowing them a little better. But I still wonder if there's some issues there. But through looking into these other areas, whether it's non-humans or open questions about metaphysics or indigenous perspectives on things, Lafferty is one of the key sources that helped me shift from what I feel was an unhealthy place to be culturally and so on in my own past. And that's just kind of where that stands for me, but it's an ongoing perception for me of Lafferty, like it's developing. But because that's the way I see it at the moment, I think that's why I'm like, Lafferty definitely has crazy problematic attitudes in his fiction, and yet, he also has really opened my mind and my heart, so like, what's going on there? How do I deal with that? What is that? Are these contradictions? Are they, and so on. And I've mentioned before that, nobody needs to read Lafferty. I'm not here to tell you need to read Lafferty. If the whole world just wants to go, you know what? We don't need one more guy out here being problematic about race and so on, and being a Holocaust denier. Who cares how awesome his fiction is? Don't want to read it. And if everybody gives him up for that reason, fine, so be it. I can't blame you for that. I think for the time being, I will continue to read him and try to confront these issues amongst other things, as well as just read his fiction in general, wherever it goes, whatever it's doing. To the degree that he's still going to be on the scene, I think he needs to be read in all possible ways, critically, and analyzed as to what he's doing with all these things, so that we can have a good critical reception of his work and not just leave the problematic elements just sitting there undealt with. But, people are dealing with this in terms of like philosophers like Heidegger and wondering what to do with his pro-Nazi views and whether that invalidates his philosophy or not. And I think that, we may be in similar territory with Lafferty. And again, I don't mind if people end up going, yeah, Lafferty's just disqualified. I think it's infected all his work, as some people do with Heidegger. I also don't mind if people critically look at Lafferty's work and say, well, here's what we can take out of it and why this ultimately is strong enough to counteract this other aspect that is problematic, which is what some people do with Heidegger. In regard to, say, how to read Lovecraft in relation to his racism, I will point you to, at this moment, the most recent episode of SF Ultra, where Sean looks at Lovecraft's work. The episode's called Red Hook Variations because Lovecraft's story, Horror at Red Hook, is one of his most blatantly racist stories. And as usual, Sean is so insightful and entertaining about the topic he's talking about. So, maybe go over there and listen to Sean talk about SF readership, speculative fandom or whatever, reading Lovecraft in light of these things, and think about how that might apply to reading Lafferty. So I don't know if anybody's made it through this ramble. I hope maybe if people just watch the first few minutes, they'll have seen enough to go, okay, this is an issue with Lafferty. Let's keep that in mind. And then now that I have brought it up, I feel like I can finally move forward and go on with chapter by chapter in Past Master and other things on Lafferty and others that I want to do. And it's going to be really relevant to the upcoming chapters in Past Master, where I think Lafferty expresses some more potentially problematic conservative attitudes. And I will now be able to kind of bring this issue into further discussion of Lafferty if need be, where it's appropriate, and maybe direct people back to this video to say, oh, I opened this discussion there, or I started to nod toward it. But thank you everybody for, watching this and your patience with my output here. Those who really like these videos and have said kind things about them, and your patience with this particular ramble. I really need help from the community, to be honest. I would, maybe I should have started the video with an appeal. Maybe I'll even record a bit. You'll see if I've recorded a bit that's at the beginning, like saying, look, I need the community's help on this. Such as it is. I mean, it's such a tiny, tiny, tiny reading community of Lafferty, but it's a growing one here on YouTube. I'm actually going to do a video on a couple new reactions to Lafferty from YouTubers. But I wish that Lafferty's readership was like Gene Wolfe readership or something like that, where, you say just one thing and it's just like endless comment about it. Because especially in this case, it's like I just really need to hear from the rest of the readership, like, how are you guys taking this? How do you fit this in? What do you think? And if there's that kind of discussion going on, I can bounce off of that so much better and have things to say. And I will say, this is the reason I've taken so long to do this, points to potentially one of my, I won't say a flaw, but one of my design limitations. And that is that I can hardly do anything unless I am somehow inspired and feel some. I mean, like, I have to, work hard to do anything, and to you put in effort to whatever you do, but there needs to be some kind of spark of inspiration driving me on some level. And whilst I think this issue of Holocaust denial and related things is super important, and I feel touched by it, I feel like cut by it, and etc. I'm struggling to find the thing that inspires me about it, even in a negative way, inspires me to tackle it or whatever. I'm better at just going like, look at this chapter, look at this passage, look at this story. How cool is that? Let's talk about it. Oh, and here's some problems in it or whatever, not going, let's address this like nonfiction comment that somebody made and, try to deal with it, or just tackling things from like that kind of topical perspective is just not my wheelhouse so much. And so every time I've been contemplating making this video, I'm just like sitting there not inspired, going like, here's this thing I can really sink my teeth into. And so again, I'm trying to say that this is where it would be so helpful to have a larger readership talking about this kind of thing, because I know some people are super inspired by this kind of stuff and go, let's get in there and like dig up the dirt and deal with it and so on. All right, that's all I got. That's all I got. We'll see if I even put this video up. But thanks again, and hopefully there'll be other content coming soon. Take care. Bye.
Webbing is torn, some black galactic thing is born. When will the star children start? The astral call is clawed apart. Helical passion and ashen death joy, a saintly sex fish and chthonic boy. The amniotic ontic webbing is torn, and some black galactic thing is born. Star